So, hello and welcome back to our final night with the Phoenix Endangered. We only have two chapters and an epilogue left, and although they are quite meaty ones, I will do my best to sum them up in a decently short manner. Hopefully, this won't be like an hour and a half or anything. I feel like it's almost as long to sum a chapter up as it is to read it straight, and that's kind of hilarious to me. I also was out today and I was walking and I was thinking about the old books that I've read so far. I mean, granted, it's only been The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and that Fortune Wildred. And then I'm comparing them in my head to modern books, and I can't put my finger on what it is that is the biggest difference. There's something in the characterization, and it's kind of funny to me, mostly because I started reading the new Steve, well, I don't know if it is new at this point, but new to me Stephen King book Fairy Tale that I picked up when I was picking up the other like old books. And it's really good. And there's something stylistically in a more modern book that just sucks you in really fast. Or maybe it's just the authors that I choose to read. That could be it too. I'm kind of curious as we venture forth into the public domain a little bit more, if maybe it's just a difference in the language. I do love some of the flow of the older books because they were very, I would almost say, lyrical as you're reading them. They're, in a lot of ways, they're delightful to read out loud just because of the way the language flows, but it almost doesn't draw me in the same way, at least with the two that I've read so far. This may change as we venture deeper into the public domain, but that's the biggest thing. And I was thinking about that as I was walking today and trying to put my finger on the difference and what it is that is the disconnect for me. I don't know if I'm ever going to figure it out, but maybe I will. Anyway, this book has no disconnect for me. It's been one that I have enjoyed very much, and I hope you guys are at least enjoying the recaps as we jump back into chapters 20 and 21 and the epilogue of The Phoenix Endangered by the wonderful Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory. And chapter 20 is titled The World Beneath the World. Now, chapter 20, we join instantly in with Harrier and Tercel and Sharia and all of the Nalzinder as they're learning a lot to work together. And I really love the opening paragraph. So that is what we are going to start as I quote directly from the chapter. Harrier spent the next several days getting used to the idea that not only was he not going to be dead immediately, there was a chance he might not end up being dead at all. He had also made up his mind that the way the wild magic worked offended him in a way that he really couldn't articulate. He also wasn't going to try, now that he and Tercel were living with the Nalzinder, because they felt about the wild magic the way that the people of the 9 cities felt about the light itself, so it wasn't exactly something that Harrier could make fun of. He thinks a little bit more about the wild magic and how he doesn't really want to make fun of it. And, it's just, he doesn't like the fact that maybe it was the wild magic's plan all along that they end up here in Abiyabadashar, and to get them here, the wild magic allowed like thousands of people to die. And he isn't sure that that's really the way the wild magic works, but he's not sure that it isn't. And, you know, he's just feeling a lot of pressure as a wild mage because the Nalzindar absolutely think that wild mages are indispensable and worthy of all sorts of respect. And the only thing he had to do to prove to them that he was a wild mage is light the evening fire, and now they just implicitly trust them. And, they're a little bit more unsure about Tercel, but since Ann Keldar vouches for him, they implicitly trust him too. And Tercel and Harrier just don't always fit in. And Harrier thinks about the fact that maybe Bisochim was just the only wild mage in like 1,000 years that the Endarkin could taint. And they're trying to figure out why Bisochim even believed everything. And they really don't know. Tercel shook his head slowly, still reasoning things out in his own mind. I know that Sharia keeps talking about Bisochim as if he's tainted hair, but I don't know if he is, at least not the way a light priest always talk about the taint. And so they're trying to figure out, is Bisochim the actual enemy, or is he just deluded? Now, later on, they talk to Sharia about their ideas, and she's absolutely convinced, no, Bisochim is just shadow tainted. He's not just being misled. And Harrier finds himself sort of in between the two of them because he isn't sure which one it is, but he doesn't think either of them are exactly right. Sharia does not know exactly where the Lake of Fire is, but obviously they've been able to figure out that it's got to be in the one place that Ann Keldar can't go. And they know that they're going to need to go there, but not yet. Because there's all of Abiyabadashar, and they really want to explore it. Quoting, the Nalzindar hadn't been able to do much exploring. There wasn't any light down there at all, not once you got below the level where Shariah's people lived. Tercel simply solved the problem by making the walls glow. The small balls of cold fire that Harrier made tended to vanish after a few hours, which everyone was actually more comfortable with. The wild magic was something that they knew and understood, though the things that they told Harrier that were commonplace astounded him. Find water, create wells, turn aside a sandstorm. He wasn't sure how he would even begin to do those things. Fortunately, Shariah's people weren't asking him to do any of them, which meant that Harrier wasn't having to explain anything about being a night mage. And meanwhile, having Tercel try to explain that the walls remembered having been lit up this way, which was why they were lighting up that way now, it was almost more than the Nalzindar could take. Harrier thinks that it's almost more than he can take. He doesn't understand it, and neither Ann Keldar or Tercel could really tell him enough to make him even kind of understand it. But as they light up the walls, they discover that the walls are carved and beautiful, and they keep finding all sorts of things, and it's obviously elvish manufacture. And they're kind of thriving in an odd way. We shift over to Tercell's perspective for a little while, and quoting from this, Tercel thinks about, he had no intention of ever telling Harrier this, but Tercel was grateful that they had found themselves in Abi Abadashar, because that meant he wasn't facing Bisochim in the Lake of Fire. He tried not to think about Tarnatha Atreyu because he was ashamed of how much of it upset him. It was even more humiliating to know that Ankildar could see what he was thinking, because Tercel knew that Ankildar had seen far worse in his long life, and he probably thought that Tercel's reaction was out of proportion to what had happened. So Tercel's, I would say, almost got a little bit of PTSD, and who could blame him? A siege of a city, staying awake for about a week, and then the fighting and everything, and then being kidnapped. Yeah, I'd be messed up too. He thinks about, the people that he killed, the ones who had crashed into the Mage Shield. He thinks about, Harrier, and the fact that Harrier had to kill people to save them. And he thinks about how the city smelled when everyone was dead, and it's just not really cool. Quoting again, in order to distract himself, he spent his time trying to fit into the life of the Nalzindar and exploring Abi Abadashar. Whenever he would start to go wandering off, Shariah would insist on accompanying him, not because the tunnels were dark, because they weren't, not anymore. He had meant to cast a temporary spell of mage light on the walls, since the spell could be used to make objects glow as well as to form nebulous balls of light, but he had ended up making the walls, ceiling, and floor glow permanently with an eerie full moon glow. But Shariah accompanied him because she was convinced he would get lost or into some other type of trouble. In a lot of ways, Shariah reminded Tercel of Harrier. And so they continue exploring, and they keep going down. Tercel asks Shariah how many levels the place goes down. And Shariah says that she has no idea. They went down a little bit, but it's really hard to do without lanterns or torches. Tercel looks around and is like, well, I got it all lit up. And Tercel also asks Shariah, isn't she curious about what else is down there? And it sort of shows a big difference between the Nalzindar and the city dwellers, that she's just grateful to be alive and grateful to be hidden away from Bisochim and having her freedom, or at least as much freedom as you can have when you're hiding in a ruined city. She does kind of let slip that they had to do away with a lot of their things. They don't have very much at this point. And that's when Tercel is like, well, I've got a whole bunch of supplies, and Ankildar could just go get them for you. So Ankildar does. And he does it in the dark of night because Shariah had forbidden Tercel and Ankildar to go before the moon set, or to go once the sun even is getting close to rising. But he brings back a good amount of supplies and offers to go get more, but it's enough. And Shariah tells them not to go again. The Nalzindar, though, are absolutely gobsmacked with what is brought back. quoting, "Though the Nalzindar were a silent people, and now was no exception, both Tercel and Harrier saw expressions of joy on every face, as warm cloaks and thick blankets and proper heavy quilted sleeping mats were unpacked. Morap forgot herself as much as to utter a soft cry of delight when more cafea was revealed, along with its proper cooking pan and brazier, and the other Nelzinder women had greeted the stores of flour and oil and cooking stoves with equal amounts of joy and relief. Long before the last of the items from the campsite at Tarnatha Atreyu had been inspected and carefully replaced, the garden was filled with cooking smells and the scent of brewing kafea. Shariah is extremely pleased, not only because there's all of this stuff that they desperately needed. I mean, they were surviving, but they now have a few little luxuries, but also because all of the things that Tercel brought that are woven and made of cloth means she can put off having to learn to spin thread for a little while longer. So they're going right along, and the next little bit of time kind of settles into a routine. Harrier is helping the Nalzindar. It's kind of funny. He's learning some things about being a wild mage that he never really thought about. Like, one of the women brings some berries to him. She wants to know if they're edible. He looks at them and goes, I don't know, they look kind of like cherries. But when he brings them to his mouth, the wild magic just tells him no. So he's learning a little bit. And when he's not trying to fit in with the Nelzindar, he is exploring with Tercel. And, it's a pretty good life. It's not the life that they were expecting, but that's okay. Quoting again, no matter how many times when Tercel came back at the end of a day's explorations to tell Harrier what he had learned, and Harrier said, yeah, but does it say how Veely What's-Her-Name got rid of the Indarkin that time? Then Tercel would shake his hands and head and say that it's not that simple. But they were learning things. They aren't sure exactly what they're learning, but they are learning that the deeper they go, the bigger the passages are, which is kind of weird because at first, whenever Ankildar wanted to explore with them, he was very cramped. But as they get down to the 5th level below the surface, they reach places where Ankildar could stand up straight and walk around in complete comfort. Harrier and Tercel are down at the bottom, and Tercel points out to Harrier that he can kind of read the walls. It's a little bit wild to Harrier. He doesn't understand how Tercel can read ancient Elven. And Tercel lets him know that actually it's a lot like the glyphs from High Magic. And besides Harrier, it's pictures. I mean, anybody can figure out pictures. And so Harrier's like, great, what does it say? And basically what it says is, Tercel cleared his throat. It says here that the dragon's bond was supposed to be a temporary condition. I'm not sure I've got that right, but there's something about the bond and something about time and something about a mage price being fulfilled, and I can't figure it out. But what I can figure out, and I'm sure about this, is that when the bond is paid, the dragons will stop dying. Yeah, well, that time obviously isn't yet, Harrier said before he was able to stop himself. No, said Tercel, sounding wistful. I guess it isn't the time of 3 becoming 1 yet. I'm not even going to ask what that means, Harrier said, as Ankildar lowered Tercel gently to the floor again. Good, said Tercel, because I don't know which 3, or how they become 1, or what it has to do with anything. Do you think it means that there won't be any more elven mages? You're asking me, said Harrier. No, said Tercel, stepping off of Ankildar's head down to the floor. I'm just asking. Fine. Now, do you... Oh, I really don't think you're going to like this, said Tercel. Look, Tercel, we know that they won, said Harrier. Yeah, but I'm starting to think that they didn't do it here. As in, they weren't in Abiabadashar. Oh, by the way, the name means something like glorious rightful rule or city of the red bones, in case you were interested. Anyway, they didn't fight the Endarkened and cast them out here. You know about the fire sprites, right? No. They were an ancient race that the Endarken killed off, but not until a long time after Abiabadashar was built and abandoned, because this is where the fire sprites lived, Harrier, here in the Barileth. And the elves made an alliance with them, and one of the provisions was that they would leave. And you know this because of the pictures. Right. Which they put on the walls because they liked putting things on walls? I don't know, Harrier. The point is that the elves built the city as a part of their war against the Endarkened, and then they made an alliance with the fire sprites, and they turned the war in this area over to them. And then they left this city. Which basically means, once Tercel is done explaining things to Harrier, that whatever they're looking for probably isn't here. But they're going to keep exploring anyway. And after they get that straight in their minds, they head back up along a very long trip back up to where the Nelzindar are, up in their second level below the surface. And, you know, they're fitting in. And Tercel decides that he really likes the Nelzindar, and that makes him feel a little bit sad because, you know, he probably would like the other Isvani as well. And he also kind of is a little bit freaked out that this is all of the Nelzindar, and there's only not that many of them. Quoting, Shariah had told Harrier that this was all of the Nelzindar that there were, and there were only 30 of them, and that included 3 babies too young to walk, and 2 kids that Tercel thought were probably somewhere around the age of 2, and 1 who was maybe 4, and a couple who were 7 or 8, and a boy of about 12 who spent all of his time staring at Harrier and Tercel as if he had never seen anything like them before, and he hadn't said a single word in their hearing the entire time they'd been there. So there were only 21 adult Nelzindar, and only 7 or 8 of them even looked old enough to be the age of Tercel's father. Tercel asks discreetly if maybe Sharia just recently took over as the leader of the Nelzindar, because from what Tercel can tell, she's about the same age as Harrier. And he finds out that no, she's been leading the Nelzindar for years now. And that, again, brings home the differences between their people. But he's determined to be a good guest, and, you know, he spends evenings with them. And again, another thing that just brings up the differences between people from Arameth and the Nalzindar is, even though he's trying his best to be a very good guest, they just they don't talk much. And after they do their evening meal, they just go to bed. They don't sit up and talk or anything. Sharia and Sinarin, her best friend, do try to make Harrier and Tercel feel a little bit better. They're trying just as much as Harrier and Tercel are to kind of meet in the middle with these people, but it's you know, not exactly comfortable for either of them. And that's sort of brought to a crux as Tercel asks Sharia, what her plans are. And she says, I'm going to stay here until I know that Bisochim is either dead or gone, and I'm going to lead my people, and that's about it. Tercel's like, you're going to stay here forever? There are other places that you could go. Sharia does not like the idea of being anywhere other than where she is. She is a child of the desert, and she says that she would never live in a wasteland of frozen water like the cold north where he is from. And Tercel tries to make her understand about it, but it doesn't really. Neither one of them understand each other. And then, to his irritation, Tercel heard Harrier laugh out loud as he stumbled through explaining about the North, and even Sinarin gave a single chuff of amusement. But it had become clear to both of them, to all of them, that the thought of the Nalzindar traveling to a land where they had no idea how to survive would be stopgap at best. It might offer temporary safety, but if Bisochim could not be stopped at the Lake of Fire, that safety would be very, very temporary indeed. And that is where the chapter ends, and Christine goes to get a drink before we move on to the last official chapter, chapter 21, The Double-Edged Gift. I'll be right back. So, chapter 21, the final chapter of the second book of the Enduring Flame trilogy, is titled A Double-Edged Gift. Harrier and Tercel start off the chapter still exploring Abiabadashar, but they're arguing about it now. They are now down to the 10th level that they've gone down. They've discovered that the deeper they go, the colder it gets, and the bigger everything gets. And Harrier's like, we haven't found anything at all in the last 6 or 7 levels at least. I don't know why you want to keep going down. Quoting, it was now a full moon turn since the two of them had arrived in Abiabadashar. There were whole stretches of time when Harrier could forget things. The destruction of Tarnatha Atreyu, the thought that the man who had given him his swords and taught him all that he knew about using them was certainly dead. The fact that this was only a way station on their way to destroy the Firewoman and stop Bisochim, and only when it was very late and he was completely alone did Harrier ever take out and look at the thought that stopping Bisochim was going to mean killing him. So Harrier is still suffering from his own PTSD. I mean, I don't know if it would be clinically diagnosable, but it does seem like it to me. And so he followed Tercel. As Tercel looked for answers and practiced with his swords down in the echoing stone depths where none of the Nalzindar could see him, because he couldn't bear the thought that any of them might see what he was doing and praise him or want to teach him or want him to teach them what he knew. And he did whatever he could to help the Nalzindar in peaceful ways, and he read his books, and he hoped that some solution to their problem would present itself. But maybe not a solution if it meant that Tercel intended to descend to the center of the world to look for it. They argue back and forth a little bit more. Harrier would like to just get Tercel to stop and actually think of a plan instead of this endless searching. And Tercel is very reluctant, and we finally get to the crux of it with Tercel saying, "So I think this place is shielded somehow against the Endarkened. Come on, Hare. If Bisochin was looking for the Nalzindar, wouldn't he have found them? You could. It's a seeking spell. Remember how you told me a couple of moon turns ago that I had to be careful about what I brought back from the Isvani camp at Tarnatha Atreyu in case I brought back something that Bisochin could seek and use to find the Nalzindar? But he wouldn't even need something like that. To see something or someone, it's a simple spell. I could. Sharia said that she's met him, so Bisochin knows what she looks like, and I could find somebody if I knew what they looked like, and so could you, couldn't you? So the only reason that he hasn't been able to find them is because they managed to hide in the one place within a couple thousand square miles that's shielded against the Endarkened, and it still works after about 1 million years? Pretty much. So that means that you think there might be some other magic here that still works? Pretty much. And you didn't mention this a moon turn ago. Why? Harrier asked with long-suffering patience. If not for the fact that Ankeldar's head was between him and Tercel, he would have contemplated smacking Tercel. Yes, it was wrong to hit someone who was unarmed when you were armed, and Harrier never went anywhere without his swords. But he didn't think that that was meant to apply to Tercel. And the people that had come up with all those rules, well, they hadn't known Tercel either. Tercel points out that they haven't found anything below the 5th level, but there could be something deeper. And they still arguing round the corner, and now they are approaching the 10th level, and Harrier can't see how far down the steps go because they need to light them up, which Tercel does after Harrier tells him to do it. Tercel grumbles and says he doesn't know why Harrier doesn't do it. And Harrier says, "Because I don't make walls glow and light up for 7 nights or forever, that's why. Go on. We brought our lunch, but we didn't bring dinner." Harrier really hated eating down there anyway. It didn't matter how big the space was and how well lit it was. He couldn't stop thinking about the fact that there's like tons of rocks above their head, and it just felt very crushing. He steps away from the wall, and Tercel reaches out, touches the walls, and they light up glowing blue, which still kind of gives Harrier the creeps. And as soon as the spell lights everything up, Tercel stops. "Well, that was odd," said Tercel, looking at his fingers. "Odd's not good," said Harrier. "No, I haven't felt anything when I cast a spell since I bonded to Ankeldar, but I felt something this time." "I felt nothing bonded," said Ankeldar. "It's probably a lack of air to breathe down here, or the fact that we already hiked 10 miles on a breakfast of cold roast goat. We have food poisoning." For just a moment, When Tercel had spoken, Harrier had felt uneasy, but Ankeldar's words chased away his fear. The dragon's senses, especially for things of magic, were so much stronger than his or Tercel's, and through the bond he could feel everything that Tercel did. If there was something down here, and it wasn't something that bothered Ankeldar, well, maybe it was whatever they were looking for. Maybe they would have a weapon and a plan by dinner. They bicker a little bit more, and Ankeldar, to reassure everyone, says, "I shall go first, bonded," said Ankeldar firmly, "in case you have sensed something I could not." Without waiting for a reply from either of them, Ankeldar stretched out his neck and began slithering down the staircase. Like all the staircases on the higher levels, this one was curved so that if you were standing on one end, you couldn't see the other. The staircase passages were enough narrower and lower than the open spaces of the lower levels themselves for Tercel and Harrier not to want to share them with Ankeldar, even though there was actually enough room. The great black dragon slithered quickly down the wide, shallow steps. Abiabadashar was a place definitely designed for dragons, and he coiled his long, sinuous body around the bend in the staircase. Harrier had just watched the tip of Ankeldar's tail flick out of sight, thinking, he must be almost there, we can head down now, when Tercel suddenly fell to his knees with a scream. "He's gone! He's gone!" "What? What?" Harrier couldn't figure out whether to grab his swords or grab Tercel. Tercel was thrashing around on the floor as if he had been stabbed, but when Harrier dropped to his knees beside him, he couldn't find any trace of a word. "Tercel!" he shouted. "Ankeldar!" Tercel screamed. His voice should have echoed off the walls, but nothing echoed down here. The sounds were all flattened and hushed, the way sound was against a snowfall. Harrier sprang to his feet, and he drew his swords. He didn't know what good he could do against something that could hurt Ankeldar, but he had to try. He agonized for a long instant about leaving Tercel behind, but he knew that there was nothing either here or behind them, and every second might count. He ran down the glowing blue-lit staircase with his swords held out before him. The flat sound of his footsteps and the distorted sound of Tercel's ragged sobbing were the only sounds that he heard. Harrier runs down the steps, turns the corner, and there's nothing there. Behind him, he could still hear Tercel screaming, and that actually brings back memories of Tarnatha Atreyu, which is not doing his nerves any good. "No, no, no," Harrier whispered. "This couldn't be happening. This could not have happened. Dragons don't just vanish," he told himself. But this level was different than all the others. The Nalzindar lived on what was pretty much the ground level of Abiabadashar. What would have been a cellar if there had been houses, and the houses were still there, and the space the Nalzindar occupied was anything like a cellar, but this space was 9 levels below that cellar. On all of the levels where the Nalzindar lived, and this one, the walls and even the ceiling had been carved. There were pictures like the ones in the Temple of the Light, a lot more cryptic though. There were rows of things that might have been pictures and might not have, and rows of things that looked like Tercel's high magic glyphs that Tercel said was writing. But the floor had always been smooth on every level. Here, the floor was carved. Harrier looks at the floor and sees it's not really carved, it's textured, and if it's carved like anything, it's almost like little wavelets. And it's really, really weird because the mage light that was cast that make it glow is like pooling, so it's darker in the bottoms of the waves. He pulls out a coin and he throws it, and it just bounces. So obviously the floor is not lava, but he doesn't know what to do because Ankeldar's not there. I mean, there's nowhere for Ankeldar to have gone. He turns and runs back to Tercel and asks what happened. I don't know, Tercel whispered. He's gone. The bond is broken. No, it isn't, or you'd be dead, said Harrier. Sympathy was the last thing Tercel needed right now. Harrier knew that instinctively. Tercel already thought this was a disaster. The last thing that he needed was for someone to agree with him. Harrier didn't know if he was telling the truth or not, but he did know that what he was saying was what Tercel needed to hear right now, and at least some of it had to be true. He hadn't known a lot about dragons till they got into the elven lands, but he had learned a lot, and it all boiled down to one thing. To kill either half of a bonded pair, the other half would die immediately. Tercel finally sits up and asks Harrier what happened and where was Ankeldar. And when Harrier says that he's not there, Tercel does not believe him and goes running down the stairs, around the corner, with Harrier pounding along after him. But whatever made Ankeldar disappear doesn't do the same thing to the boys, because Tercel runs right out into the middle of the room, yelling for Ankeldar. Tercel had stopped calling for Ankeldar, but he hadn't stopped looking for him. He was moving quickly down along the nearer wall, touching the surface as if checking for hidden doors. But it wouldn't matter if Ankeldar was hidden behind a hidden door, would it? Ankeldar had been hundreds of miles away, asleep, and he and Tercel had still been linked in a way that Harrier didn't quite understand. Able to communicate in some way so that Tercel had been able to call Ankeldar to come and rescue them, because they were bonded, and that was something Harrier had never really understood, not because he was jealous of the friendship that they shared, but because Tercel couldn't explain it, and Ankeldar had never tried. The closest Tercel had ever gotten to an explanation was telling Harrier that knowing that Ankeldar was there was like knowing that his foot was there. And Harrier had laughed so long and hard at hearing Ankeldar compared with a foot that Tercel had never tried explaining again. But what that meant now was that no matter where Ankeldar was, Tercel should know that he was there if he were alive. And if Ankeldar was dead, Tercel should be dead too, and Harrier didn't want either one of them to be dead, and he really didn't want Tercel to be dead. And if Ankeldar was dead, what had killed him? And where was the body? Harrier remembered that Petrovich had vanished when he had died. Sandalon, Elven King's dragon, that was, who had given up his life back in the Elven City as the price for the spell that had bonded Ankeldar to Tercel. But he didn't want to think about that, because that meant that Ankeldar could be dead and there would never be a body. But then Tercel should be dead too. That much Harrier was sure of, because Ankeldar had been sure of it. For a dragon to have a second bondmate was apparently the next thing to completely unheard of, but it wasn't completely unheard of. And if Ankildar or any of the elves who had suggested it had thought that it would work differently from a regular bonding, they would have said so. They look a little bit more, well, Tercel does. And finally, Harrier's like, we need to go back. He's gone, Tercel repeated, numbly, running a hand through his hair. It had come out of his tie a while ago, and it hung around his face in lank strands. I don't understand what happened. Harrier sighed. Neither do I. Look, we'll go back up and maybe there'll be a spell, okay? But if he had been hoping to get Tercel to focus on the long climb back to the upper levels, his words had the opposite effect. A spell? Tercel almost shouted. You really don't get it, do you? Ankildar's gone. The bond is gone. I'm never going to be able to do another spell in my entire life. If you're expecting me to go to the Lake of Fire and defeat Bisochim by magic, well, you better get used to the idea of living under the rule of the Endarkened or being dead, because... We'll worry about that later, said Harrier. You didn't have Ankildar when you started out, and we'll think of something. I didn't have the 3 books then either. We'll think of something. Come on. He slowly gets Tercel back up to the upper levels where they let the Nelzindar know what happened. Tercel is really doing bad, and one of the Nelzindar women bring him a little bit of something to put him to sleep, because that seems to be about what he needs right now. Well, Harrier tries to explain to Shariah what happened. Something I don't understand happened on the 10th level, said Harrier. Ankildar vanished. Tercel says that the bond is gone, but he's not dead. There's no place that Ankildar could have gone. The 10th level doesn't look like the rest, and there's nowhere down from there. Shariah, although she is very sympathetic, really her first concern is that there's nothing tainted down there, which Harrier is able to tell her that no, there's nothing tainted, but we're kind of up the creek at this point. I'm not sure what we're going to do, said Harrier at last. Without Ankildar, Tercel doesn't have the power to cast spells. It's hard to explain. You should try, said Shariah. Harrier tries to go on and explain a little bit, and he's finishing up with, and even knowing a little high magic the way he does, Tercel keeps telling me that he doesn't know much, and Ankildar always agreed. Well, maybe at least then we had a chance. Now, he can still make cold fire, and he can still call fire, but that's about it. For anything else, he needs Ankildar's power to draw on. He runs out too fast. The equivalent of Ankildar, well, there's nothing. Not since there were high mages in Arameth doing something that Tyr and I don't really understand that made their magic work. We were investigating the rest of the city because, well, Tyr hasn't had any more visions since he got here, and he was guessing that the city had wards around it, wards that still worked. It has to be why Bisochim hasn't found you, and why Tercel hasn't seen the Lake of Fire since we got here. He thought if there were protective wards, then there might be something else. It seems there was, said Shariah. I just can't figure out why any spell set up by a bunch of old elven mages would hurt a dragon, said Harrier. I do not claim to understand the minds of the elder brothers, much less the minds of their ancestors, said Shariah. But it eases my heart to know that we cannot be found, no matter how eagerly the Tainted One seeks us. Harrier is happy for Shariah on that, but he also points out that, we can't stay. At least Tercel and he can't stay because, we aren't going to find anything else here. We know which way we have to go, and, well, now there's no more reason not to head down that road and go fight Bisochim, even though now they don't have Ankildar. Sharia says, okay, I'm coming with you. Harrier's like, no, excuse me, no, you can't do that. And Sharia's like, I can too do this. Who are you to tell me what I can and can't do? And besides, do you really think you can make it through the Barileth and not have a Isvani guide along with you to help you find water? And that's kind of where they leave it. But Harrier does try one last time to make Sharia stay. Wait, Sharia. Harrier couldn't quite bring himself to touch her, but he lifted his hand, caught halfway between exasperation and a feeling that he couldn't name. He swallowed hard. I really don't think that we're going to be coming back. Sharia's expression softened, and she reached out and placed her hand on his knee for a moment. I know, she told him, and Kamar will lead the Nalzindar wisely and well. And that is actually where the chapter ends. So, Ankildar's missing. Obviously we know he can't be dead. If he were dead, Tercel would be dead, although maybe with the bond put in place the way it was, it doesn't work like that, because you would think if anybody would know if the bond was still there, it would be Tercel, because he is Ankildar's bondmate. And now, with no dragon, they seem to think it's a good time to go and assault the Lake of Fire. Doesn't seem like the wisest course of action, but it will make a very, very good third book. So the epilogue brings us back to Bisochim, who has been waiting for Xanatar to bring these demon children to him. He's prepared, he's made his strongest wards, he thinks it's going to be absolutely wonderful, but when Xanatar shows up, he doesn't have any demon children. And he tells him about the dragons, and he tells him about everything that happened in the Atreyu cities, and now Bisochim is kind of panicking. And book number 2 ends with this final paragraph. His Isvani had destroyed the Atreyu cities, thinking to deny their resources to an invader. Bisochim had taken the water from the wells and the oases of the Isvai for that same reason. But Xanatar had spoken of a dragon coming to the rescue of his captives, and if the enemy army marched with a dragon-bonded mage at its head, well, not having water won't matter. The power that mage would be able to call on, equal to Bisochim's own, would allow him to call water from the rock and sand anywhere he chose. Enough to provision an army large enough to destroy all who sheltered here at the Lake of Fire. It would allow them to destroy everything Bisochim had worked so long and hard to achieve. There was only one thing Bisochim could do. He must work faster. And that is how book 2 ends. With an utter disaster. Not gonna lie, that's kind of a disaster. I don't know what exactly Harrier is thinking, except for the fact that he's probably not thinking. I mean, if it were me, I'm not a good hero. I would not make a good hero at all. If it were me, I'd be like, all right, well, Ann Kildar seems to be missing, and I don't think we can win this fight, so we're just going to stay here with you, Shariah. That would be what I would do. But I am not a hero in a fantasy novel, obviously. So, anyway, we have one final book to go through and recap, and that is The Phoenix Transformed. And we know that this is not Ann Kildar because it's red, so that must be Saravase. And book 3, on the back, we'll just go ahead and read it really quick. When best friends Tercel Rolfert, a young nobleman, and Harrier Gillian, the son of the city's portmaster, ran away from home to find a cure for Tercel's headaches and nightmares, their biggest worry was how badly they would be punished when they got back. A year later, Night Mage Harrier and High Mage Tercel have much more serious concerns. The beautiful and deadly Ahiren, given human form by the rogue wild mage, is determined to create a new race of demons. Tercel and Harrier, along with Shariah, the leader of a nomad tribe, are all that stand between Ahiren and the realization of her darkest desires. The magnificent dragon Ankildar has vanished, leaving Tur heartbroken and practically powerless. Harrier fears his own magical abilities are nearly useless, merely delaying the inevitable destruction of everything he holds dear. Shariah faces a grim decision: to lead her people into the teeth of danger or part forever from a young man she has come to love. With more than one twist in the telling, centering on a magic-plagued journey across the blistering desert, The Phoenix Transformed is the stunning conclusion to the enduring flame. I wish that the backs of books didn't give away spoilers. I mean, granted, Harrier was halfway to touching Shariah, and she did touch his knee, so obviously that's just instant fantasy book sign that they're going to fall in love. But still, also, I kind of wish that it hadn't given away on the back of the book that Bisochim's going to at least partially succeed. Oh, well. You know what? It just makes it that much more fun now that you have a tiny little spoiler. So thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that, and I hope that you join me as we go through and do a recap of The Phoenix Transformed when I sit down here with you next time.